The rain had not let up since noon, and by the time Jack Halden pulled his 10-year-old Honda into the customer lot of Cole Premier Motors, the sky over the city had turned the color of wet concrete. He sat for a moment behind the wheel, watching the wipers drag streaks across the windshield, and reached over to check on his daughter in the back seat. Emma was 7, buckled in, clutching a stuffed rabbit with one ear chewed soft from years of comfort. She was watching him with the patient, trusting expression only a child gives a parent she believes can fix anything. "We're just going to look," Jack told her. No promises. She nodded like she understood, though she didn't. Not really. She was too young to understand that the transmission on their old car had been making a grinding sound for 3 weeks, or that Jack had spent the last 2 nights doing math at the kitchen table that never quite balanced. All she knew was that her father had said they were going to look at new cars, and to a 7-year-old, that sounded like an adventure. He got out, circled around, and lifted her out of her seat, setting her down under the wide awning that kept the rain off the row of gleaming sedans parked at the entrance. He wore a gray canvas jacket, jeans, and work boots that had seen better winters. His hands were rough in the particular way of a man who fixed things himself rather than paying someone else to. Nothing about his appearance suggested wealth, and nothing about it was meant to. Inside, the showroom smelled of new leather and coffee from a machine near the reception desk. Fluorescent light bounced off polished hoods. A salesman glanced up from his desk, took in the state of Jack's jacket and the child holding his hand, and returned to his phone without a word of greeting. It was the manager who approached, and it was the manager who would matter. Derek Cole moved through the dealership floor, the way certain men move through rooms they believe belong to them, chin slightly lifted, shoulders back, footsteps loud enough to announce his own importance before his voice ever did. He'd built his identity around this dealership over the past 6 years, first as a top-performing salesman, then as floor manager, and finally, 18 months ago, as general manager of the entire location. He knew every number on the board. He knew which customers were worth his time within the first 4 seconds of seeing them, or believed he did, and that belief had never once been challenged in a way that mattered. He looked at Jack. He looked at Emma. He looked at the puddle of rainwater forming near Jack's boots on the showroom tile. And something in his expression tightened, not quite a sneer, but close enough. "Can I help you find the exit, or is there something specific you're after?" Derek asked, and he smiled when he said it. The kind of smile designed to sound like a joke to anyone listening and land like an insult to the person receiving it. Jack didn't flinch. He'd absorbed worse from better men. "I'm looking at the sedans out front. The blue one, if it's available for a test drive." Derek's eyes flicked toward the parking lot, toward the car in question. A model that started well north of what a man in a $10 haircut and boots held together with duct tape usually walked in asking about. "That one's spoken for," he said smoothly, which was a lie, and both of them seemed to know it. "We've got a lot in the back that might be more your speed. Something a little more practical for a family situation." The words landed exactly the way Derek intended them to. Emma looked up at her father, sensing without understanding that something unkind had just been said. Jack felt the familiar heat rise in his chest, the old instinct to defend himself, to list his qualifications, to explain that appearances were not the whole story. He'd learned a long time ago that explaining himself to men like Derek Cole rarely changed anything. It only fed them. "I'd still like to see the blue one," Jack said evenly. Derek exhaled through his nose, glanced toward the 2 salesmen watching from their desks, and made a decision he would replay in his mind many times over the coming weeks, though never with the clarity he needed. "Look," he said, dropping the pretense of politeness now that he had an audience. "We get a lot of folks who come in to window shop with their kids. It's not really the best use of anyone's time. If you can't afford something on this lot, there's a used place 2 exits down that might work better for your budget." The showroom had gone quiet. One of the salesmen shifted in his seat. A woman near the finance office paused mid-sentence. Jack looked at Derek for a long moment, not with anger, but with something quieter and harder to read, an assessment, the way a man might look at a crack in a foundation he was about to decide whether to repair or condemn. Then he crouched down to Emma's height, told her they'd get ice cream on the way home instead, and walked her back out into the rain without raising his voice once. Derek watched them go and felt, for a fleeting second, a flicker of something he would have called satisfaction if pressed, though it wasn't quite that. It was the feeling of a man who believed he had correctly identified someone beneath his attention and removed them accordingly. He turned back to the floor, adjusted his tie, and forgot about the encounter by the time he reached his office. He would remember it again in 3 weeks, in a conference room, when the name on a legal document made the blood leave his face in one long, silent drop. 3 weeks earlier than that morning, though it would take the story a while to circle back and explain it properly, Jack Halden had been sitting in a lawyer's office 2 states away, listening to a man in a bow tie explain that his estranged uncle, a reclusive investor named Walter Voss, had died without children of his own and had left the entirety of his automotive holding company, an umbrella group that owned 11 dealerships across 3 states, to the only family member who had ever visited him in the nursing home without asking for money. That family member was Jack. Jack had not grown up wealthy. His mother worked 2 jobs, his father had left before he could form memories of him, and his uncle Walter, the black sheep of an already fractured family, had been more myth than man throughout Jack's childhood, a name mentioned rarely and usually with disapproval. It was only in the last 4 years, after Jack's wife passed away and left him raising Emma alone, that he had reconnected with the old man, driving out on weekends when he could afford the gas, sitting with him in a sun-bleached common room and listening to stories about cars and bad decisions and the family he'd alienated over decades of stubbornness. Jack had never once asked Walter for anything. That more than any business acumen was why the inheritance had landed on him. He hadn't told anyone. He hadn't updated his wardrobe, hadn't leased a new car, hadn't changed a single visible detail of his life, because the truth was he hadn't yet decided what to do with 11 dealerships and the weight of a company he'd inherited but never asked for. His lawyer had advised him to take time before making his ownership public, to observe the properties quietly first, since sudden visible wealth invited a particular kind of scrutiny and a particular kind of flattery, neither of which Jack had any interest in. So for those 3 weeks, Jack did the only thing that felt honest to him. He visited the dealerships as a customer. He wanted to see, before anyone knew who he was, how his uncle's company actually treated the people who walked through its doors. Cole Premier Motors was the 4th location he visited, and it was the first where a manager had told him to leave. He drove Emma home that day, mostly in silence, replaying Derek Cole's words, not with fury, but with a colder, more deliberate kind of attention. He was thinking less about himself and more about the 2 salesmen who hadn't looked up, the woman near the finance office who had gone quiet rather than intervene, and what that silence said about a workplace where a manager could speak to a customer that way in front of witnesses and expect no consequence. The following Monday, Jack called his lawyer and asked for the full personnel and performance file on the Cole Premier Motors location, along with 6 months of customer complaint records, internal HR reports, and financial performance data. He didn't explain why, not yet. He simply asked, the way a man asks for the truth when he has decided he is finally ready to hear it. What came back over the following days painted a picture more troubling than a single rude comment to a father and daughter in a parking lot. The location's customer satisfaction scores had been quietly declining for 11 months, masked on paper by aggressive short-term sales numbers that looked impressive in isolation but told a different story when placed alongside a pattern of customer complaints that had mysteriously never made it into the corporate reporting system. There were 7 formal written complaints filed by customers over the past year alleging they had been steered away from vehicles, spoken to dismissively, or in 2 cases, outright refused service based on nothing but their appearance. All 7 complaints had been logged by the same HR coordinator and had all somehow been marked resolved, no action required, within 48 hours, each one closed out by Derek Cole himself. A conflict of interest that should never have been permitted in the first place. There was more. A junior salesperson named Priya Anand had filed an internal grievance 5 months earlier alleging that Derek had taken credit for a large fleet sale she had personally closed, presenting it to corporate as his own achievement to secure a quarterly bonus, and that when she raised the issue privately, he had begun cutting her hours and reassigning her best leads to other salesmen as retaliation. Her grievance, like the customer complaints, had been closed within days, this time by a regional HR representative named Grace Okafor, who notes in the file suggested had raised concerns about the pattern but had been overruled by someone higher up the chain who wanted to avoid unnecessary disruption during a strong sales quarter. Jack read every page twice. He was not a man who moved quickly on anger. He had learned, through the slow grief of losing a spouse and raising a child through it, that the most dangerous decisions were the ones made in the heat of a single moment. So instead of acting immediately, he did what he had always done when something needed fixing. He gathered every piece of it, laid it all out where he could see the whole shape of the problem, and began, quietly and without announcement, to build a case. He returned to the dealership 8 days after Derek had turned him away, this time without Emma, dressed exactly as he had been before, the same jacket, the same boots. He wanted to see whether the treatment had been a one-time lapse in judgment or something closer to a habit. It was a habit. He watched from a distance as a young couple in work uniforms, clearly coming straight from a shift, were steered by a different salesman toward the oldest inventory on the lot without being shown anything in their actual stated budget range, the salesman's tone dripping with the same faint condescension Derek had used, an attitude that had clearly trickled down from management and calcified into culture. He watched an elderly man in a flannel shirt ask about financing options and get handed a business card and a vague promise to follow up that everyone in the room understood would never come. And when Derek himself walked the floor that day, he passed within 10 feet of Jack without recognizing him at all. Too focused on a well-dressed customer in an expensive coat to spare a glance at a man he'd already filed away as unimportant. That more than anything told Jack everything he needed to know. Derek Cole was not simply having a bad week. He had built an entire operating philosophy around who deserved his attention and who didn't, and he had trained an entire showroom floor to follow his lead. Jack began attending regional leadership calls that week, quietly, listening in as an unnamed observer while his lawyer handled the introductions with corporate, as a matter of routine ownership transition. He heard Derek's voice on one such call, confident and easy, reporting quarterly numbers to a room of people who had no idea the man they were praising for strong performance had built that performance on a foundation of buried complaints and stolen credit. Jack said nothing. He simply listened and took notes and let Derek keep talking. Priya Anand, meanwhile, had reached a breaking point of her own. 3 days after Jack's second visit, she sat in her car in the employee lot after her shift, staring at a termination notice on her phone screen, official reason listed as performance concerns and repeated tardiness, neither of which had ever been raised with her in writing before that morning. She had been the top closer on the floor for 2 consecutive quarters. She knew exactly why she was really being let go, and she knew exactly how little power she had to prove it. What she didn't know was that her termination file, drafted and approved by Derek Cole that morning, would be the single document that finally moved everything into motion, because it was the first personnel action taken at Cole Premier Motors after ownership of the parent company had officially transferred, and under the terms of transition, all terminations required a secondary sign-off from the new ownership structure before taking legal effect. Jack's lawyer flagged it within hours. Jack read it that same evening at his kitchen table after Emma had gone to bed, and for the first time in 3 weeks, he felt something shift from patience into resolve. He didn't call Derek. He didn't send an angry email. He did something far quieter and far more permanent. He requested a full independent audit of the Cole Premier Motors location, covering the complaint handling process, the HR grievance history, the sales attribution records, and every termination processed in the past 18 months, to be conducted by an outside firm with no ties to the regional management structure. He also requested that Priya Anand's termination be immediately suspended pending review, though he made sure that instruction traveled through corporate channels in a way that revealed nothing about who had issued it or why. The audit took 11 days. What it found was worse in its accumulated weight than any single incident could have suggested. A pattern of discriminatory treatment toward customers based on appearance, documented across dozens of declined or mishandled sales opportunities that had cost the dealership real revenue even as short-term numbers looked healthy. A pattern of credit misattribution benefiting Derek Cole specifically, inflating his own bonus structure at the expense of the salespeople actually generating the sales. A retaliatory culture that had pushed out no fewer than 4 employees over 18 months. Each termination dressed up in vague, unverifiable language about performance, each one following closely behind a complaint or grievance the employee had raised. And at the center of nearly every thread, the same signature, the same closed tickets, the same name. Jack scheduled a meeting at the dealership for a Thursday morning, told no one the real reason, and asked his lawyer to arrange it simply as a routine ownership visit, the kind every location on the new roster would eventually receive. Derek, when informed the new owner would be stopping by, spent 2 days preparing, rehearsing a tour of the showroom, polishing his numbers into a presentation designed to impress, confident, as always. that whatever meeting was coming would end with him being praised. The morning arrived gray and quiet, not unlike the rainy afternoon 3 weeks earlier. Jack walked in wearing the same gray jacket. Derek was waiting near the reception desk, dressed sharply, hand already extended in greeting toward the conference room, where he assumed a stranger, some faceless new owner, would soon appear. When Jack stepped through the door instead, Derek's outstretched hand hung in the air a half-second too long before he lowered it, his easy smile faltering as recognition arrived in pieces. The jacket first, then the boots, then the face itself. Derek started and stopped, because the sentence had nowhere good to go. Jack Halden, Jack said, extending his own hand now, calm and unhurried. I believe we've met. The silence that followed stretched long enough for the receptionist to look up from her desk, long enough for one of the salesmen near the coffee machine to freeze mid-pour. Derek's face had gone the color of the sky outside, the practiced confidence draining out of him in real time, replaced by the particular panic of a man watching every assumption he'd ever made about power and appearance collapse at once. Jack didn't raise his voice. He didn't gloat. He simply asked Derek to join him in the conference room, along with Grace Okafor from Regional HR, who had been quietly asked to attend that morning without being told exactly why, and a representative from the independent audit team, who arrived with a folder thick enough that its presence alone answered most of the questions still forming behind Derek's eyes. What followed inside that room was not dramatic. There was no shouting, no theatrical confrontation, nothing that would have made for an exciting scene in a lesser story. Jack laid out the findings calmly, page by page, giving Derek every opportunity to explain, to contextualize, to offer some version of events that might soften what the documents already made plain. Derek tried. He spoke about pressure from corporate to hit numbers, about the difficulty of managing a large sales floor, about intentions that had simply been misread. But the paper trail did not care about intentions, and Jack had spent 3 weeks making sure the paper trail told the whole truth. You told a father you'd let his daughter go hungry rather than sell him a car, Jack said at one point, not as an accusation exactly, but as a fact laid gently on the table between them. That father happened to be me. But there were others before me. Priya Anand closed a sale you took credit for, and when she objected, you took her hours instead. An elderly man asked about financing and got a business card in silence. None of that was pressure from corporate, Derek. That was a choice you made, over and over, because you believed no one who mattered would ever check. Derek had no answer for that, because there wasn't one that would have held up. The resolution, when it came, was handled the way Jack handled everything, without spectacle. Derek Cole was terminated that same afternoon. The decision documented thoroughly enough that no appeal would find footing. His severance calculated fairly under the letter of his contract because Jack had no interest in cruelty, only in accountability. Grace Okafor, whose earlier concerns about the closed grievances had been overruled by someone above her, was promoted into a newly created oversight role, specifically designed to prevent complaints from being buried again. Her judgment finally given the authority it had always deserved. Priya Anand's termination was formally reversed, her file cleared, and she was offered not just her position back but a promotion into a floor leadership role, a decision that made sense on paper and felt, to everyone who had watched her work, long overdue. Over the following weeks, Jack visited each of his 11 dealerships in turn, no longer disguising who he was, though he never leaned on the reveal for effect. At every location, he implemented the same policy that would come to define his ownership. Every customer complaint would now route directly to an independent review channel outside the local management structure. Every sales credit dispute would be resolved through documented transaction records rather than manager discretion, and every termination would require a second unaffiliated signature before taking effect. He wasn't interested in running dealerships that merely avoided lawsuits. He wanted to build places where a father in a worn jacket and a woman in a work uniform got treated with the same baseline respect as anyone in an expensive coat, not because a policy manual demanded it, but because the culture no longer permitted anything less. 6 months later, Jack brought Emma back to Cole Premier Motors, now simply Premier Motors, the old name quietly retired along with everything it had come to represent. The showroom looked much the same, new leather, new coffee machine, same wide windows overlooking the lot. But the woman at the front desk greeted them warmly, and Priya, now floor manager, crossed the room to shake Emma's hand with a seriousness that made the girl beam with pride. Jack walked past the spot near the entrance where he had once stood in the rain being told to find the exit. On a low shelf near reception, mostly unnoticed by customers passing through, sat a single object he had insisted be kept. The visitor badge Derek Cole had worn the day of the meeting. The one he'd taken off and left on the conference table without being asked. A small plastic rectangle that meant nothing to anyone who didn't know the story behind it. Jack had asked that it stay there, not as a trophy, but as a quiet reminder to every manager who walked past it that the people who came through those doors deserved to be seen for who they were, not measured against the price of their jacket. He crouched down beside his daughter, who was studying the blue sedan on the showroom floor, with the same open curiosity she'd shown 3 weeks before it all began. "Can we look at this one?" she asked. "We can do more than look," Jack said, and for the first time since that rainy afternoon, he let himself smile without any weight behind it at all. Outside, the sky had cleared, and the lot gleamed under an ordinary, unremarkable sun, the kind of light that made no announcements and needed to make none, because the real change had already happened, quietly, the way the most lasting kind usually does.